The methodological debate in evaluation is a bit similar to debates about policy analysis or about philosophy of science or about policy making. They are all at a certain level because evaluators tend to be generalists. So occasionally you'll find an academic who is a specialist in some aspect of educational psychology or policy analysis, and they will have in-depth knowledge. But in general, most evaluators read an article, speak to an expert, and take on board what the gatekeeper from that specialist field says is the latest thing. So, if you want to know about methodology, I once met a methodologist at a cocktail party and she said this. Or I read it in the journals that I approve of. So journals are another gatekeeper which allow bodies of knowledge to be packaged in a way that can be consumed by an evaluator. Most evaluators they're not different. I think one of the problems is specialization. Evaluators haven't yet woken up to the fact that there are so many different ways to be an evaluator these days that you've actually got to be a specialist. Just like you go to a hospital, you get the ear, nose and throat man, or you get the guy who's going to look at your kidneys, or you're going to look at the orthopedic surgeon, and they are different people. And I think in evaluation, the big question is how far we recognize that, for example, there are evaluators who can go and interview people, write down the notes accurately, put on a good face when they do it, and that'll work in NGO evaluations, field work, provided it's part of a bigger team, in some development settings, in some community settings. It won't work if you're going to examine how policy is made in national treasuries in the US or Canada. For that, you actually need to know something about the content, and you need to have a different set of interpersonal skills, and you need to have ways of analyzing it which are somewhat different from the ways you... So basically, I think there is a problem about evaluation specialization, and there's a problem about knowledge acquisition. Most knowledge is acquired through gatekeepers. So there's one guy who brings a large body of knowledge into the field, simplifies it, packages it, and then you are able to pick up on it. And often the gatekeeper will have his or her own prejudices. So they will emphasize this way of doing it. So there will be people today, for example, in evaluation who say, I'm a realist. And they once read an article by Ray Pawson on realist evaluation. And it's a good article. They think now that when anybody talks about realist ontology, which is an entire body of philosophical thinking within the social sciences, that they know it because they read this one article or attended a talk by the guy. And that's one of the problems in evaluation. And that's one of the reasons why, at the very least, we need to have teams of people working together, because then you can have some representation of different levels of specialism, as well as people who are distinctly evaluative. Then you get into the question of, well, what differentiates an evaluator from a researcher, or from a good field worker, or from a manager who talks to her colleagues? There is an element of evaluation which is identical to all of the above. So know about gathering data, know about collecting, knows about methodological ways of analyzing, knows about drawing balanced conclusions from confusing evidence. The bits that are distinctly evaluative is, what value do you place on those conclusions? What criteria do you use to draw conclusions? What values do you place? Are they ethical values? Are they to do with some policy goals, sustainability in the planet? That's at that end. But at the other end, there's also a set of things to do with working with stakeholders, which are about involving different perspectives, not simply taking a contract saying, I will do this, but actually saying, there are different people involved. What do they think? How can I involve their ideas in the design of my work? So basically, in a good evaluation team, you will have some people who are indistinguishable from good researchers or indistinguishable from good field workers. But you need to have some people who can add the distinctly evaluative bits, which may be about stakeholders, maybe about ethics, maybe to do with putting a value on things, and balancing those things in a single team is what makes the game special. An evaluation journal is one way in which you bring into the field new ideas. And when we set up the journal evaluation, we had a number of distinctive ideas in our head. One was evaluation had been very much construed as a North American practice, not only in terms of style and content, but in terms of the institutions that people worked with, the assumptions they made about how decisions were made, the faith or otherwise they had in the role of the state. Broadly in North America, people have a much lower faith in the state than we do in Europe. Intellectual traditions of thinking and analyzing and using ideas, which is much more grounded in the European policy communities. So we wanted to be able to express that in a way that was helpful to people working in the European Commission, in the British government, in the Swedish government, in Spain, where they were just beginning their learning to be evaluators. And very early on, you discover that what you thought was a nice, positive, open-minded contribution to enlarging knowledge becomes very personal. You know, people get very worried that you reject their article. People take it quite personally that referees have criticized their work. And I have people even today who won't speak to me because the journal, through its processes, has rejected an article that they wrote 5 years ago. You know, I've been banned from seminars on the grounds that our journal did the wrong thing. At the same time, we have enormous opportunities to shape debates, to open up new ideas that are not currently in vogue. And I can honestly say that we could take a decision to publish certain kinds of articles now, and in 2 or 3 years' time, everybody will be submitting papers on this subject to conferences, both in Europe, in North America, in Australasia, because you do have that opportunity to open up people's minds to these sorts of things. I think there's a difference between being independent in the sense that the job you do requires that you're impartial and are able to form judgments and is institutionally independent. You're not tied into the stakeholders in this institution. I don't work for them. But that doesn't mean that you're an isolated person who never engages with others. And one of the ways you can achieve that is by defining the issue as not being about blaming people, but about understanding problems. So if, for example, you're working with someone in an organization, you don't say, I'm standing away from you and asking you, why do you have these problems? You're relating to them, having a conversation perhaps about the issue, or asking them to provide you with some data about the issue. And you're looking for their help in how to understand how we got to be where we are today. And we want their help in understanding the constraints that prevent the remedies that many people would want to apply to these problems. So you don't regard people as being the cause of the problem. You regard people as being allies in helping understand the problem, especially if you believe that people working within systems are amongst the most knowledgeable as to why things are the way they are, how they can be changed, and how they can be further analyzed. So that's why the dichotomy that was presented in one of your questions, about being isolated or being independent seems to me to be missing the point of good methodology in fieldwork, where you actually have to work in an engaged way. A lot of people in what I call broadly the helping professions go into it partly with personal motivations, and being loved is a classic one for social workers, you know, that I want to help other people, but really I want to be helped. This is unkind to many social workers who are friends of mine, so hopefully they will never see this film. I don't think that a professional doing their work worries about being loved or hated. If they're a competent person, they don't set themselves up as an enemy of the field. They set themselves up as an ally of, we all want to solve this problem, how do we understand it better? Now, I think the issue of the kind of data you're using, I've been working within the frame of mind of a field worker doing qualitative work. A lot of work that evaluators do also involves administrative data or statistics or third-party information that you then collate and integrate. The issues of independence there, which sources you go for, what weight you give to different types of information, is of a different order. But I would argue they're not very dissimilar, that you actually need to have that kind of constant awareness that you're not here to find the guilty party, you're here to find out what explains the situation you're in, and to use people from the field to help you interpret the stuff rather than sitting in isolation and doing it for yourself. That's a sort of an interesting question. I mean, I've never worked in a war zone, for example, which I know many people in the UN system do. And I guess I've been fairly lucky in avoiding some situations that could be extremely risky. I did, for example, once work for a few weeks in the Philippines, and I had a nice man with a Kalashnikov who used to drive me around and look after me for the 2 weeks I was there, and I never understood why. But I understood subsequently that lots of people were getting kidnapped, and it was probably a good idea to be looked after. But the nicest part of that entire enterprise, which was a very productive evaluation, visiting farmers, looking at laboratories, looking at policies around rice, talking to government people. The last night before I went home, I said to my driver, the guy with a Kalashnikov, "So what are you doing this evening?" He said, "Oh, I'm just going to meet up with some of my friends." So I said, "Well, I'm not doing anything this evening. I think I'll join you." So he said, "No, you can't do that." I said, "Well, why not?" So I ended up in a karaoke bar, which was entirely populated by people with Kalashnikovs who'd been driving foreigners around for the whole of the week, singing karaoke songs. And I must say it was one of the best evenings on an evaluation mission that I've ever been on. And partly what I'm saying is that I think working in the field requires that you do have to make your own assessments of risk, and it does reflect your own personality and the way you like to live your life. You know, I'm not somebody who, even in my home life, stays within the safe boundaries of go to work, come back from work, visit only my friends, have dinner parties. I tend to go out. I go out in the city. I meet friends in areas of the city which some people might consider to be risky after 2 in the morning. So I think there has to be some kind of acceptance that not everybody is exactly the same. And I also think that you need to understand the context of what you're evaluating. And for me, the context of what I evaluate is knowing what's going on around you. And if a lot of people are feeling physically unsafe, a lot of people are feeling at risk, you at least need to recognize that and know it without putting yourself at risk unreasonably. So I don't think I have any neat answers to this sort of thing. I think I do take the view that some situations are unevaluable. I'm not convinced, even by some of my friends who've worked in post-conflict situations and who say, yeah, we can work in this sort of situation. I've looked at some of the evaluations they've produced, not all of them, but some of them, and thought this was probably not worth doing because it was so compromised by absence of data, by compromises of access to who you had access to, in the limited possibility of local people participating or validating your results, that you shouldn't be too confident in it. But I think generally you can do some things in most situations. I think what that also raises for me about methodology, which is evaluation has gone down a methodological turn in the last 5 years, which everybody's very concerned with more and more sophisticated methods. One view I would take is that if you ask the right question, analyzing the answers needn't be so complicated. And sometimes we don't ask the simple, straightforward question in a way that could be useful to users and policymakers. And then we have to go through all sorts of complex analysis in order to explain and interpret and enrich the material. So I think, getting the question right is really important, and having users of the evaluation who are willing to use your stuff in a serious way is also important. I think it's very, very rare that an evaluation has an immediate impact. We know from research into the uses of evaluation that, and this has been known for 25, 30 years, is that it's a slow accretion of knowledge over time. It's the drip of new information, I think is what Carol Weiss used to call it. And it's also synthesis of multiple studies rather than relying on one. And it's also random processes of learning. So I'll give you an example. I was called up a couple of years ago by a guy whose name I did not remember and did not recall. And he said, "Hello, Elliot. Now, I've been thinking about what you said to me," and I was scrabbling around thinking, who the heck is this fella? And he then went on to describe a project that I'd been involved in 10 years previously. And I gradually began to remember what this project was about. And clearly, he had been thinking about this project and what had come out of it intermittently throughout his career. And he was now a senior manager. He'd moved from being a middling person to being the director of a large social services department in part of the UK. And for him, the lessons of the evaluation had been bubbling away, and then at a moment when he could do something about it or use that body of knowledge, it became relevant for him. And that's an extreme form, but I think very often knowledge becomes relevant in a context that hasn't yet been imagined. And all of a sudden, people look back and say, we knew that at that stage, how can we draw on that? The other thing that leads me to recall is the lack of organizational memory. So very often it's the opposite of that. People do evaluations and forget about them. Organizations get reorganized, teams get reconstructed, bosses change, priorities change. People don't know what they've done. Here's a nice little anecdote for you to finish off with. I get called up by a guy from ministry in the UK who says, somebody says that about some while ago we did a project in vocational training around technology and managers, and it involved innovative pedagogy and using open learning methods. Nobody in the ministry knows what the hell this project was about. Somebody said, call Stern, he'll probably remember, he's been around a while. So somebody calls me up, gets through to me, and I say, yeah, you're talking about the XYZ project. That was done about 14 years ago. And he says, well, we've got no papers in the ministry. And I say, well, I've got all the papers in our archive. I've got the annual reports of all the projects over 5 years, the signed off reports that went to the minister, which I helped write, all the press cuttings, got the lot. Guy says, can I send a taxi round to collect the archives? And I said, no, you can't. I don't trust you. You can't be trusted with your own material. You can send a guy round with a large budget for photocopying, and he can stand at our photocopy and he can copy your papers for as many hours as it takes, but you cannot take them away because you've convinced me that you're not reliable. Now, that's a jokey but genuine example, but the real point I'm making is that people don't know what they know. Knowledge gets lost. Phrases like organizational memory are tossed around without really knowing what you have learnt. And it's not about lessons learnt in terms of a fact. Tell me 5 facts that I can put in my inbox. It's much more knowing about how these things happen and being able to translate those lessons into different contexts. And that requires much more tacit knowledge, much more deeply embedded knowledge, which is the bread and butter of organizational memory and is actually very rare in evaluation. So I'm here today and I hear conversations that I remember in another UN agency 15 years ago. And I go to a European Commission office and I hear things that I know have been done by another part of the Commission and they don't know about. And that's a real issue in our world, which is how is knowledge accumulated, shared, preserved, made available, accessed when you need it.